Hello, welcome to Media Snack live from New York.
And greetings from a sunny London.
Yeah. So if you were watching last week, we discussed what we said was, robots versus humans when it came to media planning on the back of some news, and we'll just kind of recap that a bit later on. But what was really interesting, it provoked a lot of debate, and we've been seeing quite divided opinion on whether the future is the robots and the artificial intelligence taking over the idea of media planning, and to what extent you need humans involved. Some of very good comments, but some particularly good ones asked what we think was the right question, which is actually what do marketers want, which is actually probably more important. And one of the most articulate ways of seeing that question came from Omar Oakes, who's the media and technology editor of Campaign, who actually had originally written the story, breaking story about Wavemaker's artificial intelligence approach to media planning. So we're very delighted to be welcoming Omar onto the show. So he'll be joining us a little bit later on. So stick around for that. What we wanted to frame this as, particularly, is then looking at this from the marketer's perspective, right? And David used to be a media director at Coca-Cola and Nike, and the challenges there. And so we'll come to give some advice of what we think maybe marketers should be, how maybe marketers should be thinking and framing this challenge. What we do know, and we've discussed a lot over the years, is that what marketers really, really, really want is competitive advantage. They don't really care too much about who does what, perhaps. They may care about what it costs to get it done, but really what they want are results. They want growth, and that got to be grounded in what we tend to refer to as category advantage, right? Beating your competitors, or being able to do something better than your competitors more effectively or more cost efficiently. When we think about the agencies over the years, we've moaned a bit about agencies being hard to distinguish as networks, and historically, and we've even joked, and I think it's a kind of an in-joke, or it used to be an in-joke perhaps, that you could take the credentials, the presentations of agencies, switch the logos, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell which agency did what work. And a lot of that was because historically agencies have been really obsessed about this story of buying power and scale. And they were all on this kind of race, which became the race to the bottom, as we talked about in a couple of episodes ago. So it was hard to distinguish. So they were really trying to differentiate themselves in terms of their buying power. And then the narrative had moved on to really the quality of talent and the value of talent, of the people that work in the agencies, the quality of the people that you can have working for you as a marketer. And then maybe the narrative is shifting more into actually technology being a differentiator. And we're seeing agencies take perhaps slightly different paths in the way that they approach that. In recent years, in their either acquisition or not of data companies and the way they provide data to advertisers to give them better information and better insights. But this AI discussion is big. There are some agencies that are quite heavily investing in automation, different platforms, as we've discussed. So is technology the answer? If an agency can prove out a return on investment, which is really what the nub of this is about, if the agency can show that the value of this to the advertiser and maybe use it to demonstrate the value of media, not just the price of media, which is really the narrative progression that we've been encouraging, then really that is ROI for media. So that's what we're going to dig into today. Again, my intros turned into half the episode as usual, but okay, so let's stop. So what is going on? Let's just kind of reframe the debate before we explore it from a marketer's perspective.
Well, you're right. It's about competitive advantage, but it's about competitive advantage from the perspective of the advertiser. And it's about competitive advantage from the side of the agency. So traditionally, the competitive advantage from the agency side has been perhaps through discounted costs, through aggregated media billing and media buying. And as you say, most recently through the ability to provide really smart Top Gun talent to kind of clients. But ultimately, they will redefine themselves based on how they can provide competitive advantage to the advertiser. And what the advertiser wants is smarter, more effective use of that media investment. If they can illustrate that taking that money and investing it in smart ways delivers improved business growth for advertisers, then that gives them competitive advantage. And so actually this is not about a race of technology. This is about a race to prove ROI, prove return on media investment. And we were thinking about this following last week's episode where we talked about Wavemaker's new planning tool that optimizes at the speed of light, that can figure out multiple different options based on kind of machine kind of learning. Now, the proof of the pudding is if that can deliver competitive advantage because it is better at illustrating how an advertiser's media investment can be more productive, then they will win. That it's not the end game. It's simply an enabler of offering competitive advantage to the advertiser. So, we've talked about ROI within, advertising or media agencies for a number of years. There was one agency who, as a tagline, had the ROI agency, right? Perhaps slightly nebulously, because at the time nobody could prove it. But we are getting into an environment. We're getting into an industry where the ability to link media investment with a business outcome, so the ability to empirically link return on media investment, is getting there. And if Wavemaker's Maximize tool does that better than anybody else, you know what? They're going to open the windows and business will come rushing in.
Yeah. So just think about what the implications of that for the advertiser particularly. I mean, and news to agencies is that brands really don't care about your technology. I mean, their headlines are good, I'm sure, and keep you visible, but the brands don't care about the technology. They don't really care about the whole faster, better, cheaper, particularly because that's just a means to an end, as you say. They don't care that we are celebrating ourselves for transforming the industry. The priority is getting that competitive advantage. Now you can do that because it's a value equation, right? So if you're hiring an agency to do a job for you, if that agency can work more efficiently, that's the first thing, then maybe it can work cheaper and maybe it can deliver a result more cost effectively. The question that we'll come to then is kind of what role the humans play in that potentially, because the technology is available. What's to stop the advertisers? And we're seeing this increasingly, invest in their own technology, take more control, build capabilities internally to do this. This trend, which commonly called in-housing, although we don't like the word, but we keep using it for some reason, was an interesting example. Just picking one agency because they've got a few headlines. We had talked about Wavemaker and their kind of machine learning ambitions. Dentsu is another agency group which is kind of interesting in this space. They actually have somebody with the title Chief Automation Officer, who's been in the business a couple of years, to try and find at an enterprise level, ways that the business is agency groups are quite fragmented, different companies, which try and find commonalities across them and try and find some back-end automation, which they're finding. Interestingly, when pushed for examples of that, I will link to there's a good story about it, which kind of writes up some interviews on that. They were asked what the application was, and they said, well, the first step is actually just getting everyone to do their timesheets. So that's kind of, there's a bot that tells everybody to do their timesheets. So I think, well, that doesn't change things massively, but it just shows you, it removes that perhaps manual or repetitive tasks. And there's this whole area of automation called robotic process automation, I'm learning, which is this idea that actually, instead of wholesale machines taking over the system, we have tools now at our disposal that can remove these manual, repetitive, administrative, or analytical tasks to help us be better. So you can kind of think of it a bit like you'd have a cyborg planner, right? Which is a kind of melding of human and machine, which is what a lot of the comments were about, which is just that balance really of being human and machine. In Dentsu's work, they had this great quote that said, we identified that there are really smart people wasting their time things that a robot could do. So I thought that's fair enough. That applies to lots of businesses. Question is then, what happens to those expensive smart people that as a marketer you're currently paying your agency for? Do they sit behind the machines and they become the kind of technical or quality control, or do we have them in the front line? Are they the interface with the marketer? That's I think the biggest. The biggest challenge is, and that's going to be the question for the marketer, right? Which I'm sure you're going to explore now, which is how much human interaction do you need with external companies, right? Or is the marketer in control? and just wants the right data and technology to be able to execute properly?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a really good question. And the simple answer is, as long as marketing is run by humans, they will need a human interface at the agency side. I mean, that's certainly for the immediate future and the time being. But in terms of the things that marketers should be thinking about, from my perspective, and the first is slightly more simplistic, and that is about changing the narrative internally. You know, if media is still seen as a cost internally, then nobody's going to listen to your arguments around investment and return on investment. Okay, so you have to pivot that conversation internally away from media being a commodity into media being a lever for growth. And if you can get traction internally, then suddenly you can begin to start putting metrics against what that means, what that lever for growth means. And you know, linking return on investment is going to be a collaborative process with both your internal stakeholders, but also kind of the agencies, and challenge them, get them to qualify areas where they can begin to start seeing links on media input and business output, because those kind of conversations, those business cases, are going to be critical to getting kind of traction and adoption internally. So number one, let's get the narrative moved away from price into one of investment. Number two, let's start talking about return on investment and linking and taking accountability of business growth through the media function. And number three, let's start getting, you know, their agency partners to illustrate what they consider to be best in class and how that can deliver competitive advantage from a business context.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So just summarize on that. You know, as always, the arbiters in this debate are the marketers. So we can all have a kind of an opinion on this, and I think it's all good, healthy discussion. And it's at a point where, you know, agencies really are thinking the long-term role that they're going to play and the value proposition to the marketer. You know, as they increasingly become suppliers of data and technology, as well as, you know, human power. To some extent, we might think that agencies, maybe they're kind of betting on the idea that marketers are not going to be willing or able to source their own technology or their own automation. But I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because as we've seen, I just referred to, you know, increasingly advertisers are building internal capabilities. The ultimate arbiter then is, you know, a phrase that we use a lot, which is that marketers want to be disproportionately more effective than any other brand in the category. And if you can do that, and that's where media investment, if it works, if every dollar you spend works harder than your competitors to achieve some kind of business outcome, you know, more effective reach, better brand sentiment, whatever it is that you think is going to drive sales, then you win. You know, you win because you can achieve more for less money, and over time you can invest that in your business. And obviously that's a good route to growth. Humans, robots, I don't know. We'll see. I love the cyborg idea. I'm going to try and do that myself. Let's just bring in Omar, if we can, Nadia, because hi, Omar.
There he is.
Tom, David, hello. Thank you for having me.
Hello, Omar.
Good, welcome. So a couple of things. I mean, you've heard us talk about our little ramble about robots and machines and things. But you firstly, you kind of broke the story last week about Wavemaker and their kind of AI, new AI tool. And I know that you track these kind of things as a technology editor and media editor, obviously. Firstly, what in your view has been the response to that? Because I've seen lots of discussion in response to that article and things that have been posted. Where do you think it's netting out?
Well, not being a media planner myself, I think it comes down to what you said about bots and timesheets. That in theory, what's not to like in terms of what was the phrase they used, being able to optimize something to death and doing 100 million executions within minutes or whatever it was. But similar to, I think of Publicis Group launching Marcel. I think of Publicis Group also launching, do you remember the People Cloud platform several years? Before I came on, I actually looked up People Clouds, and on the website, Publicis website, it takes you to that error message. It doesn't seem to exist anymore. Don't know what happened to it. But this is still a business of humans for the time being, as opposed to cyborgs, Tom. But how, you have to get the humans to buy into it. And they've obviously done a lot of work, and Wavemaker talked about the tests that they did with human planners versus the AI, and the positive results for the AI. But ultimately, the reaction tends to be along that basis in terms of how can I actually buy into this, and is it going to be like this other thing that we tried to do? There is clearly a benefit and an efficiency to doing automation, but at the end of the day, the craft of planning, whether that's tech enabled or we're relying on nous or human genius, it's the humans that are still at the interface of that ultimately.
Or is it? I don't know. I mean, if I'm a client and I need somebody that I can speak to, somebody that can humanize the technology, somebody that can make that accessible to me. But if the machine is more capable and more sophisticated than the human planner in making my media investments feel and seem and hopefully prove to be more effective, then do I really care about the kind of the craft, the old school kind of craft of media planning? As long as I've got somebody that can interpret the technology or the language of the technology into a way that I can kind of understand, do I really care?
Well, that is an interesting question, because ultimately, we've got humans as interface versus machine interface, right? So yeah. I think what's the assumption behind your question, David, is probably if I'm a brand marketer and I'm savvy enough to know how to measure these things and to interrogate the media platform, then yes, I don't care whether it's a human telling me something versus a machine, because I know how to evaluate and interrogate the machine in order to determine between the two. And I think it gets into the really interesting question of what media planners, what marketers rather, should take away from this is A, how do you measure it? B, how do you interrogate it? And C, who do I need around me in my in-house marketing team? Am I allowed to say the word in-housing? Who do I put around me that's who's going to help me do that? I think an interesting example was the Walgreens Boots Alliance. They reappointed WPP last year. And they actually talked to campaign about how it wasn't a business as usual review, and they wanted tech to be at the heart of it. And quite a flexible approach, it seems, in terms of having their own people versus people with WPP actually doing that. And I won't get into the details of it, but I think broadly that's an example of whether it's a man versus machine. It's going to be up to brands to actually skill up, if they're not already, in knowing how to measure that.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions coming through as well. Actually, I want to just jump to Nadi. Let's bring up the first one. Babakan Javed, good to see you again. I hope you're well. He said, we've seen ample proof that robots are performance driven and will compromise the brand in order to drive a sale. So a slightly more cynical view there, Baba. Hope nice, healthy one, as I might expect. With excessive retargeting, robots maybe eventually manage to sell a product, but only at a discount. It's a good point, because I think that these are some of the mistakes that we've made as an industry. Is we've automated a bit too early, haven't we? We've had all these many challenges over the years of the automating of media buying through programmatic techniques has not necessarily resulted in a great experience for the end user, and that advertising has become something that people want to avoid and will invest in avoiding. So that's probably weighing heavily on the minds of the marketer, I should imagine, which is, when I hand over to the robots, do they actually care about my brand? Is that something that can be optimized?
But absolutely. But then that links to Omar's point, which I think is absolutely valid. The responsibility then lies with the marketer to be able to interrogate and understand what he's being offered and make selective, considered and informed decisions on what is perhaps positive for his brand and what is less positive. So you're right. The emphasis, the challenge becomes the marketeers to be more sophisticated in the way that they can interpret the information in front of them.
Yeah. We have a comment from Tamas as well. Nice, simple one. Great topic. Omar, you take the credit for that. Thank you, because you started this debate. And then Diego.
Great question, Tamas. Great question.
Great question. Good to see you, Tamas. Then Diego, again, let's make a point here, but if it lifts the burden of manual optimization, that maybe enhances the craft of planning. I think as an ex-planner, maybe before real technology hit back in those days, we did have the luxury of kind of thinking of it more like a craft. And I think, you know, we speak to many people in agencies now who like the idea of being a media planner, but actually find themselves really executing an analytical and optimization exercise and dressing it up as planning. Or maybe that is what planning is. What other impacts? Thanks, Nadia. Omar, what other trends are you seeing in AI? Is this just the beginning of the tip of the iceberg? Have you got more stories on this, or more agencies that you think or advertisers that you think have got a AI story?
I think it's got to the point where you've got to have a healthy dose of skepticism over when somebody says that they have an AI or a machine learning tool, about what it actually entails. I mean, ultimately, a lot of the time, it's just a form of automation. And a dirty little secret of specialist journalism is sometimes you get very good at repeating what people say very accurately without 100% knowing what's going on yourself. And it's always the challenge to do that higher level story to do that. And that's why at Campaign we tend to restrict the flow of stories just in terms of doing our own analyses and to understand things in a bit more detail. I think it's interesting about the Wavemaker thing, by the way, because they're not the first media agency, I don't think, to actually come out with something like this. I think Hearts and Science for years now has been, they've got something they call the Brain, which I'm not an expert in, but I think was pretty much doing, they had a supercomputer where you could use machine learning to manage the sheer volume of data that was being crunched, and you could query data and lots of cool things. I've had things within a network agency for a very big FMCG client, which I won't mention, where they're looking at doing media buying with bots, for example. So there is lots happening behind the scenes, but I think ultimately you don't want to get burned and then announce something, as certain networks have done that I might previously mentioned, and kind of get caught not actually proving what you've announced. So skepticism, I think.
Are you going to follow the Wavemaker maximize story? So are you going to perhaps track how effective it actually is? I mean, they've just rolled it out, right? So presumably there are some kind of beta clients that are working with it, and I'd imagine if we find that those have been successful, then Wavemaker will want to market and PR that story. Are you planning on perhaps following that up over the next 6 to 8 months?
I think so. Yes, definitely. And I think the story behind the story, if I can call it that, is, and I think you mentioned it before, Tom, is whether developments and tools like this, whether the craft of planning is ultimately disappearing, whether everything becomes about efficiency and optimization. And the point I was trying to make before about the human element and the practicalities of it, if you've got virtual desks and you've got human beings, where is going to be the hunger for new specialisms, or is it always going to be a race to see what is the most efficient planning outcome? And again, the question about retargeting from Barbara, I think it was. I mean, that's just a classic case of garbage in, garbage out, where you've already bought something from Debenhams or another expired retailer, and Debenhams ads are following you around the internet. I don't want it. I don't need it. So where my big question around following the story of AI in media planning is, where is actually the role for creativity in this? Where is the role for creativity in media planning when you've got all of these tools at your disposal? You said before, well, technology should be freeing humans up to do the higher order skills. Creativity is one of those skills. Where is the role for creativity to fill the vacuum of automation?
You sound like Mark Pritchard. Very good.
Very good.
I've been practicing.
Thank you, Omar. If for any of you that don't yet, you should follow Omar. He's at Omar Oakes on Twitter. You're sitting right at this interesting intersection, right, to be the media and technology editor of this. And so, we follow your writing closely, and we recommend that our viewers do the same, because these are the stories, I think, which in the media world are some of the most interesting to marketers, because these are decisions they have to make. There's some big bets they're going to have to make, and expensive bets. How they build capabilities internally, what technology contracts they manage, how they determine the role of agencies, because all agencies are looking for guidance from the marketer to tell them what they're going to need in 2 or 3 years' time. There's a big upheaval coming, and we'll look to your good guidance, Omar, and reporting to help us understand that a bit better.
You're
Thank
too
you,
kind,
Omar.
Tom. Checks in the post.
That's right. It's good, but it creates a good provocation, and that's where the discussion comes from, and that's it. And we know that marketers lean into the discussion and helps them shapes their view. They don't have all the answers, like none of us do, but anything that promotes the discussion, raises that to the top is going to be helpful. So appreciate that.
Quick question for you, Tom. Obviously, doing these reviews as you do over the years, have you felt like the tone of conversation with the marketers that you speak to? We were talking before about they need to be savvy and interrogate these things. Do you feel, without naming names, that generally they do know more, or there's still a big education piece to do?
Yeah, it's the single largest change that we talk about frequently with agency CEOs. Actually, we talk about, because they kind of say like what the market is thinking about, what's going on. And the biggest thing that's changed over the last 5 years is that marketers are smarter. The advertiser is way smarter than they were 5-6 years ago. And that started, we could say that started with, provocations of things like the ANA transparency report 5 years ago might have been the catalyst to that. These kind of questions, the question marks over the digital supply chain and the waterfall and the tech tax and all this kind of the what did PwC call it, the unknown deltas. That kind of language has just encouraged marketers to lean in, because they've been asked questions now that they never used to get asked. The media director is now asked questions from the CMO about media. That never used to happen. Mark Pritchard has encouraged his whole organization to really rethink how they approach media. So that's the big thing. I think we find the advertisers are much better educated in media. So therefore that keeps the agencies on their toes, but also the advertiser wants to know how it works. They want to see the machine. They want agencies to be unpacked and a bit more transparent about the operations of media. So that's, and I think this is a great thing. And the bigger macro impacts of that are things that we've been talking about on recent episodes, which is, we're hopefully moving beyond what has been this quite antagonistic relationship between advertiser and agency to one now where they can build a bit more together. And I think now the advertisers feel a bit more confident in their own knowledge. And now we've got, we've had an evolution of agency leadership over the last few years. So we've got kind of the new management within agencies that seem to be a little bit more open to that collaborative discussion, that we're seeing them, build together in a bit more positive and constructive way. Doesn't mean that everything is solved, right? We've still got issues with the supply chain and lack of transparency and things like that. But I think it's been fantastic to have the marketer be able to sit at a peer-to-peer level and talk about this complex stuff in a much better way than they have been historically.
Yeah, I think that's right. It comes back to David's point about media's commodity versus an investment. It's a different frame of mind if you're looking to cut costs versus actually how can we make the best out of this money that we're going to throw onto something. And I think that my point about creativity in media is borne out. Is what's behind that is if it's a positive thing that marketers can be doing and actually engaging in that, as opposed to something to limit on a line item on a balance sheet. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Very good. I like that. Nadia just flashed up another comment by Tamas, which is, so this is an advertiser perspective. Maybe you want to put that back up. The use of technology. This one. This is interesting, right? So this is, if technology replaces the manual work, can we reduce the FTE costs and increase the speed of receiving media plans? Fair enough. Okay, yeah. Fair enough. It's a challenge for agencies right now, okay, because they're going to market and they're talking about this clever automation that they've got. One of the first questions the marketer has, apart from like, does it work and is there value in it, is does it reduce the cost of the agency? The challenge for the agency leadership is that they're having to fund both business models at the same time. So they're in this, period of transition, if you like, which I think Wendy Clark has been talking to you guys about this week, that you've printed, the challenges at Dentsu, offshoring some operational services to try and reduce cost, investment in technology to try and reduce cost, reduce headcount. These are huge, expensive undertakings for the agency. They're having to place a big bet here that they've got a role to play in the next 2 years, and that marketers don't just say, thanks very much, we'll take the technology, we'll do it ourselves, we'll call you. we'll see where they
Who
play
knows?
out.
Good.
Thanks for all the questions. Omar, thank you for your time. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Omar. Nice to see you again.
Thank you
Do
both.
follow Omar, as I said, he's on Twitter at Omar Oakes. But that's it for this week. We'd love some more comments. We've got loads of questions today. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Tamas was hogging the questions there. But some good ones. Thank you for that. Please let us know what you think, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.